The date is April 8, 1943. The skies over northern France shimmer with the cold clarity of early spring. At 25,000 feet, a formation of American P-47 Thunderbolts drones eastward, their massive radial engines thundering through the thin air. The pilots, young men barely out of their teens, scan the horizon with anxious eyes. This is their first deep escort mission into Nazi-occupied Europe. Below them, in the patchwork fields of Normandy, German farmers pause in their work to watch the contrails streak across the sky. They've seen American bombers before, watched them labor toward German cities with their deadly cargo. But these new fighters are different, larger, heavier, more menacing. In the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp of Jagdgeschwader 1 spots the American formation. A veteran of the Eastern Front, with over 100 victories to his name, Philipp has seen every Allied fighter the war has thrown at him. Hurricanes, Spitfires, the new American P-38 Lightnings. But this aircraft approaching his airspace is something new. He studies the silhouette through his gun sight. The massive bulbous nose, the thick wings, the sheer size of the thing. A smile crosses his face. He keys his radio to alert his squadron. Achtung, new American fighter approaching. Very large, very heavy. This should be easy, gentlemen. The German pilots laugh over the radio. They've heard reports of this new American fighter, this Thunderbolt, stories of its enormous weight, its poor maneuverability at low altitude, its tendency to dive away from combat. Some of the Luftwaffe pilots have taken to calling it the flying bathtub or the milk truck. How could such a massive, heavy aircraft possibly compete with the nimble Focke-Wulf 190 or the legendary Messerschmitt 109? But Oberleutnant Philipp is about to learn a lesson that will cost him dearly. The Thunderbolt is not what it appears to be, and within minutes, his laughter will turn to desperate radio calls as 850 caliber machine guns unleash a storm of lead that tears through his aircraft like paper. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the story of how American engineering, determination, and raw firepower transformed a mocked underdog into the most feared fighter bomber of World War II. It's a story of innovation against skepticism, of pilots who learned to master a beast that others dismissed. It's the story of how the Jug went from joke to juggernaut. To understand the P-47 Thunderbolt, we must first travel back to the late 1930s, to a world teetering on the brink of global catastrophe. In Europe, Adolf Hitler's Germany was rearming at a frightening pace. The Luftwaffe, rebuilt from the ashes of Versailles restrictions, was becoming the most modern and powerful air force in the world. In the United States, military aviation lagged far behind. While the Army Air Corps possessed skilled pilots and tactical doctrine, its equipment was obsolete. The standard American fighter of 1939 was the Curtiss P-36 Hawk, a pleasant enough aircraft, but hopelessly outclassed by the new generation of European fighters. When war broke out in September 1939, American military planners watched with growing alarm as German Messerschmitt 109s swept Polish and French aircraft from the skies with contemptuous ease. The wake-up call came during the Battle of France in May 1940. In 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht crushed what was supposedly the finest army in Europe. French and British fighters, despite the bravery of their pilots, proved inadequate against the combined might of the Luftwaffe and German armored columns. The lesson was clear. America needed new fighters, and it needed them immediately. But there was a problem. The United States had no combat experience to draw upon, no recent battles to study, no hard data about what actually worked in modern aerial combat. American aircraft designers were working in a vacuum, forced to make educated guesses about what the next generation of fighters should look like. Into this uncertainty stepped Alexander Kartveli, the chief engineer of the Republic Aviation Corporation. A Georgian émigré who had fled the Russian Revolution, Kartveli was a brilliant but unconventional designer. Where other engineers sought elegance and efficiency, Kartveli believed in raw power and overwhelming force. His philosophy was simple. If you want a fighter to dominate the sky, give it the most powerful engine available, the heaviest armament possible, and build the airframe strong enough to handle the stresses of combat. Weight be damned, elegance be damned. What mattered was hitting power and survivability. In 1940, Kartveli began work on a new fighter design designated the P-47. His starting point was the most powerful aircraft engine America could produce, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. This was a monster of an engine, far more powerful than anything used in fighters before. But power came with problems. The R-2800 was enormous, weighing over 2,000 pounds. It required a massive cooling system, and to make full use of its power at high altitude, it needed a sophisticated turbocharger system. Kartveli's solution was characteristically bold. He would build the airplane around the turbocharger. The turbocharger was mounted in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by an elaborate system of ducting. This arrangement added weight and complexity, but it solved a critical problem: how to maintain engine power at the high altitudes where modern combat was increasingly taking place. German bombers operated at 25,000 feet or higher, far above the effective ceiling of most Allied fighters. The P-47's turbocharger would allow it to chase them into the stratosphere. The armament was equally audacious. Where most fighters carried 4 or 6 machine guns, Kartveli specified 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. This was an unprecedented concentration of firepower. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, meaning the P-47 could unleash over 6,000 rounds per minute when all 8 guns fired simultaneously. The 50 caliber Browning was itself a devastating weapon. Firing a half-ounce slug at nearly 3,000 feet per second, it could penetrate armor plate, shred aircraft structures, and destroy engines with brutal efficiency. A 1-second burst from all 8 guns would send over 100 rounds downrange, enough to saw a fighter in half or blow apart a bomber. To feed this firepower, the P-47 needed ammunition, lots of it. Kartveli designed storage for 3,400 rounds, split among the 8 guns. This gave the pilot about 30 seconds of continuous fire, an eternity in aerial combat where most engagements were decided in seconds. The landing gear presented another challenge. To accommodate the massive propeller required by the R-2800 engine, Kartveli needed to either make the landing gear impossibly long or find another solution. His answer was typically clever. He mounted the landing gear far out on the wings, giving them enough length to keep the propeller clear of the ground while keeping the main structure manageable. The gear retracted inward toward the fuselage, a complex but effective arrangement. The cockpit was placed far back on the fuselage, giving the pilot excellent visibility in most directions. Behind the pilot, Kartveli specified armor plate to protect against attacks from the rear, and bulletproof glass for the windscreen. Protection mattered as much as power in his design philosophy. When the first XP-47B prototype rolled out in May 1941, observers were stunned. The aircraft was enormous, the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter anyone had ever seen. It weighed 12,000 pounds empty, nearly double the weight of a Spitfire. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it tipped the scales at over 17,000 pounds. Critics were immediate and harsh. British observers called it a dinosaur. Some American pilots dubbed it the 7-ton milk truck. The nickname that stuck, however, was the Jug, short for juggernaut, a term that could be taken as either a compliment or an insult depending on one's perspective. The prototype's first flight on May 6, 1941, did little to silence the skeptics. Test pilot Lowry Brabham reported that the aircraft handled like a truck at low speeds, with heavy controls and sluggish response. On the ground, visibility over the long nose was terrible, making taxiing and landing challenging. The cockpit was cramped despite the aircraft's size, and the complexity of the systems made it intimidating for inexperienced pilots. But Brabham also reported something else. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt came alive. The turbocharger maintained power where other fighters gasped for air. The controls firmed up as speed increased, and in a dive, the P-47 was simply unstoppable. It would accelerate past 500 miles per hour, faster than any production fighter in the world. The Army Air Corps, desperate for modern fighters, ordered the P-47 into production before testing was even complete. In September 1941, Republic received a contract for 171 aircraft with options for thousands more. The production line at the Republic factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, began tooling up for mass production. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Hawaii plunged America into World War II. Suddenly, the need for fighters was not just urgent, but existential. The P-47 program shifted into high gear. Production orders skyrocketed. Republic went to 24-hour operations, with workers streaming into the Farmingdale plant around the clock. But getting the Thunderbolt into combat would prove more challenging than anyone anticipated. The aircraft's complexity meant constant delays. The turbocharger system proved finicky, prone to failures that could cause catastrophic engine fires. The landing gear had a tendency to collapse on rough fields. The oxygen system leaked. The gun heaters failed, causing weapons to freeze at high altitude. Month after month, Republic engineers worked to iron out the problems. Test pilots pushed the aircraft to its limits, finding its strengths and weaknesses. Slowly, painfully, the Thunderbolt evolved from a troublesome prototype into a combat-ready fighter. The first production, the P-47Bs, began rolling off the line in March 1942. They looked much like the prototype but incorporated hundreds of small improvements. The canopy was redesigned for better visibility. The oxygen system was overhauled. Redundant systems were added to critical components. Gun heaters were improved. By late 1942, the improved P-47C model entered production, featuring better armor, improved radios, and the ability to carry external fuel tanks for extended range. This would prove critical, as the bomber offensive against Germany required escort, fighters that could penetrate deep into enemy territory. Training squadrons received their first Thunderbolts in June 1942. The pilots' reactions were mixed at best. Many had flown the nimble P-40 Warhawk or hoped to receive the new P-38 Lightning. The Thunderbolt seemed like a step backward, heavy, complex, difficult to master. Stories circulated about landing gear failures, engine fires, and pilots unable to bail out of the cramped cockpit in emergencies. Lieutenant Colonel Armand Peterson, tasked with training the first P-47 squadron for combat, later recalled, "The pilots hated it at first. They'd been told they were getting hot new fighters, and instead they got this massive, heavy brute that seemed designed to get them killed. I had more than one pilot request transfer to other aircraft types. The problems were real. Early training accidents killed several pilots. The aircraft was unforgiving of mistakes. A ham-fisted approach to landing could result in a bounce that led to a stall and crash. Forgetting to switch fuel tanks could mean an engine failure on takeoff. Mishandling the turbocharger controls could lead to an engine fire at altitude. But gradually, a corps of pilots began to understand the Thunderbolt. They learned to work with its weight rather than fighting it. They discovered that while it couldn't turn with lighter fighters at low altitude, it could outdive anything in the sky. They learned to use altitude and speed as weapons, slashing down at enemies before climbing back to safety on the power of that enormous engine. These early pioneers developed the tactics that would define Thunderbolt combat operations. They emphasized energy fighting over dogfighting. They used the aircraft's devastating firepower to make single, lethal passes rather than prolonged engagements. They learned to protect each other, working in pairs and fours to cover their weaknesses. By December 1942, the first Thunderbolt group, the 56th Fighter Group, was declared combat-ready. They would deploy to England to join the 8th Air Force's growing campaign against Nazi Germany. Their mission: escort American bombers deep into enemy territory and fight the Luftwaffe for control of the skies over Europe. The men of the 56th had trained hard, but they had no illusions about what awaited them. The Luftwaffe was the most experienced air force in the world, battle-hardened by nearly 4 years of war. Its pilots were skilled, aggressive, and flying excellent aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, in particular, was considered by many to be the finest fighter in the world, and soon these German aces would have their first encounters with the P-47 Thunderbolt. They would laugh at its size and weight, they would mock its appearance, and then, in the crucible of combat over occupied Europe, they would learn to fear the 850 caliber guns that could shred their aircraft in seconds. The stage was set for one of aviation history's greatest transformations, from derision to dominance, from joke to legend. The winter of 1942-43 was one of the coldest on record in England. At RAF Horsham St. Faith, near Norwich, American ground crews worked in bitter conditions to prepare their new P-47 Thunderbolts for combat. Ice formed on the wings overnight. Engines refused to start in the morning frost. The damp English weather played havoc with electrical systems and gun mechanisms. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group huddled in their Nissen huts, studying intelligence reports and mission briefings. They knew the statistics, and those statistics were sobering. The 8th Air Force had been conducting daylight bombing raids against German targets since August 1942, and the losses were mounting. Without fighter escort, American bomber formations were being savaged by Luftwaffe fighters. The problem was range. Existing American fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang could escort bombers partway into Germany, but they lacked the fuel capacity to penetrate to targets deep in the Reich. Bombers going after Berlin, the Ruhr industrial region, or aircraft factories in southern Germany, had to proceed without fighter cover for hundreds of miles. In that gap, German fighters exacted a terrible toll. The P-47 was supposed to help solve this problem, but early reports from Britain were not encouraging. Initial range calculations showed the Thunderbolt could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. Its enormous fuel-guzzling engine gave it power, but at the cost of operational radius. Without external fuel tanks, the P-47 was essentially a short-range interceptor, not the deep escort fighter the bomber crews desperately needed. Nevertheless, the Thunderbolt groups prepared for their first missions. On January 10, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group flew its first operational sortie, a sweep over the French coast designed to familiarize pilots with the combat environment. No enemy aircraft were encountered, but the mission revealed numerous problems. Radio communications were poor. Formations became separated in cloud cover. Several aircraft experienced mechanical problems that forced early returns to base. For the next 2 months, the Thunderbolt groups flew cautious missions over France and the Low Countries, gradually extending their range and building pilot confidence. They encountered German fighters for the first time in March 1943, and these initial engagements seemed to confirm the Luftwaffe's low opinion of the new American fighter. On March 3, 1943, 12 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group were bounced by Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 2. The German fighters attacked from high altitude, diving through the American formation with their guns blazing. In the confused melee that followed, 2 P-47s went down. The German pilots reported the American fighters as heavy and slow, easy targets at low altitude. This assessment spread quickly through the Luftwaffe. Intelligence officers compiled reports on the new American fighter, noting its strengths: heavy firepower, excellent high-altitude performance, ability to absorb damage, but emphasizing what they saw as fatal weaknesses. The P-47 was slow to accelerate. It turned poorly at low and medium altitudes. Its rate of climb was mediocre below 15,000 feet. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine emphasized exploiting these weaknesses. Avoid head-on attacks where American firepower was most effective, and draw the P-47s down to low altitude where German fighters held the advantage. German pilots began to develop a dangerous contempt for the Thunderbolt. After-action reports from March and early April 1943 contained telling phrases. One Luftwaffe pilot wrote, The new American fighter is no threat to an alert pilot. It is heavy and can be easily outmaneuvered. Another reported, "These American trucks are easy victories for the 190. They flee when engaged properly." But this contempt was about to be shattered. The American pilots were learning. Every combat sortie taught them more about how to fight effectively in their massive mounts. And a cadre of natural fighter pilots, men who instinctively understood how to exploit the P-47's strengths, was beginning to emerge. One such pilot was Captain Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke was a hard-nosed realist who understood that his pilots needed to adapt their tactics to their aircraft, not the other way around. He forbade his men from trying to dogfight with German fighters at low altitude. Instead, he drilled them relentlessly on energy tactics: maintain altitude, maintain speed, attack from above, and if engaged, dive away to safety. "The P-47 is not a Spitfire," Zemke told his pilots. "Don't try to make it one. We have altitude. We have speed. We have guns that can destroy anything in one burst. Use those advantages." Another rising star was Lieutenant Bob Johnson, a young pilot from Oklahoma who seemed to have a natural gift for gunnery. Johnson had scored his first victory in late March and was developing a reputation as a deadly shot. He understood something that many pilots missed. The P-47's 8 guns had to be harmonized, aimed to converge at a specific distance. Most pilots set their guns to converge at 300 yards, but Johnson experimented with shorter ranges, eventually settling on 250 yards. At that distance, his 850 caliber streams created a cone of destruction that nothing could survive. The turning point came on April 8, 1943, the date referenced in our opening. The 56th Fighter Group was assigned to escort B-17 bombers attacking the Focke-Wulf factory at Bremen, deep in northern Germany. This was the Thunderbolt's deepest penetration into enemy territory to date, and intelligence warned of heavy enemy fighter presence. The mission launched in the cold dawn light. 48 P-47s formed up over England and headed east across the North Sea. As they crossed the German coast, the radio crackled with warnings. German radar had detected them. Enemy fighters were scrambling to intercept. At 26,000 feet, Hub Zemke spotted them first, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s climbing toward the bomber stream. The German fighters were still 5,000 feet below, their pilots confident they could climb to attack altitude with time to spare. They had not yet learned to respect the speed of a diving Thunderbolt. Zemke called the bounce. "Bandits below, 10 o'clock low. We're going down." 48 P-47s rolled over and plunged earthward. The big fighters accelerated with terrifying speed, quickly passing 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. The German pilots looked up in shock as a wall of American fighters dove on them with a combined closing speed of over 700 miles per hour. The Germans tried to scatter, but they were caught in a killing zone. The P-47s flashed through their formation, guns hammering. Tracers laced the sky. Aircraft exploded. Wings sheared off. Parachutes blossomed like flowers. Bob Johnson fastened onto a Focke-Wulf 190 that tried to dive away. It was a fatal mistake. Nothing could outdive a Thunderbolt. Johnson closed to 250 yards, exactly where his guns converged, and fired a 2-second burst. His gun camera captured what happened next. The 190's tail separated from the fuselage. The engine tore loose from its mounts, and the center section disintegrated in a ball of fire. The pilot never got out. Across the sky, the story repeated itself. The German pilots, so confident minutes before, found themselves in desperate fights for survival. When they tried to dive away, the P-47 stayed with them. When they tried to climb, the American fighters followed them up. The turning fights they sought to initiate never materialized. The American pilots refused to be drawn into low-altitude dogfights where the advantage would shift, and that firepower, that overwhelming, devastating firepower proved unstoppable. A skilled Luftwaffe pilot might dodge 1 or 2 guns worth of tracers, No one could dodge 8 streams of 50 caliber rounds converging on a target. When a P-47 pilot got his guns on target, the fight was over. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, the veteran we met in our opening, was leading a section of 4 Focke-Wulf 190s when the P-47s bounced his formation. He tried to turn into the attack, a standard defensive maneuver, but his opponent, a young American pilot named Walker Mahurin, anticipated the move. Mahurin pulled lead, aimed where Phillips' aircraft would be, and fired. The convergence of 8 50 caliber guns struck Phillips' fighter like a sledgehammer. Rounds tore through the cowling, shattering the engine. The right wing folded upward, taking half the aileron with it. The cockpit filled with smoke and hydraulic fluid. Philip fought to maintain control as his aircraft tumbled earthward, trailing fire and debris. He managed to bail out at 8,000 feet, his parachute opening just as his Focke-Wulf exploded below him. As he drifted down toward the German countryside, Philip had plenty of time to reconsider his earlier assessment of the American fighter. The easy target had nearly killed him. The mission resulted in 11 confirmed German fighters destroyed for the loss of 3 P-47s. More importantly, the bombers had completed their mission with minimal losses. For the first time, American escort fighters had decisively beaten the Luftwaffe in a major engagement deep inside Germany. Word of the battle spread quickly through both air forces. On the Allied side, bomber crews celebrated their first properly defended mission. Ground crews painted kill markings on P-47 noses. Pilots who had doubted their aircraft began to see its potential. On the German side, the reaction was more sobering. The reports from April 8th could not be dismissed as American propaganda or isolated incidents. Too many experienced pilots had been shot down. Too many witnesses confirmed the lethal effectiveness of the P-47's armament. Luftwaffe intelligence officers revised their assessment. The American fighter was not to be underestimated, but some German pilots remained dismissive. These veterans, with dozens or hundreds of kills to their names, believed that pilot skill mattered more than aircraft performance. They had beaten Spitfires, Airacobras, and every other Allied fighter they'd faced. Why should this new American fighter be any different? They would learn. Over the following weeks, the P-47 groups flew increasingly aggressive missions over occupied Europe. They learned to use their aircraft more effectively with each sortie. Drop tanks extended their range, allowing them to escort bombers deeper into Germany. Pilots mastered the art of energy fighting, using altitude and speed to dictate the terms of engagement. The kill ratios began to shift dramatically in favor of the Americans. In April alone, P-47 pilots claimed over 60 German fighters destroyed for the loss of 15 of their own. In May, the numbers were even more lopsided. 91 confirmed kills against 23 losses. These statistics told only part of the story. The real impact of the P-47 was psychological. German fighter pilots, accustomed to attacking bomber formations at will, now had to contend with aggressive American escorts that actively hunted them. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine began to change in response. Fighter units received new instructions. Avoid engaging the P-47s directly unless circumstances were overwhelmingly in German favor. Priority was given to attacking bombers, accepting combat with escorts only when necessary to reach the bomber stream. This defensive posture marked a significant shift. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe was conceding air superiority over portions of occupied Europe. The psychological advantage that Germany had enjoyed since 1939 was beginning to erode. Individual German pilots who tangled with the Thunderbolt learned hard lessons. Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, who would later become known for sparing a crippled American bomber, had his first encounter with a P-47 in May 1943. He tried to engage what he thought was a lone American fighter over Holland, only to discover it was bait. 4 more P-47s dove on him from above before he could react. "I have never felt so helpless," Stiegler later recalled. "They came down so fast, their guns already firing. I managed to escape into clouds, but my fighter was badly damaged. If not for those clouds, I would have died." The American fired only a short burst, but holes appeared everywhere. It was like flying through a storm of metal, but the P-47's effectiveness came at a cost. The losses, while favorable compared to German casualties, were significant. Every week, young American pilots who had trained for months were shot down over Europe. Some were killed, others became prisoners. A few evaded capture with the help of resistance networks and made it back to England. The strain on pilots was enormous. Combat missions lasted 3 to 4 hours, much of it at high altitude where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Pilots wore electrically heated suits that often malfunctioned. Oxygen systems froze, gun heaters failed, causing weapons to jam at critical moments. And always there was the knowledge that a single mistake, a moment's inattention, could mean death. Captain Walker Maharin, who would become one of the top American aces, later described the psychological toll. Every mission felt like it might be your last. You'd see friends shot down, see their aircraft explode, and wonder when your number would come up. The only thing that kept you going was faith in your aircraft and your wingmen. In the Thunderbolt, we had an aircraft that could take damage and bring us home. That mattered more than anything. The P-47's legendary toughness became apparent as pilots returned from missions with battle damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Aircraft came back with cylinders shot out of their engines, control surfaces riddled with holes, hydraulic systems shot away, and cockpits punctured by cannon shells. The big radial engine could lose multiple cylinders and keep running. The robust airframe could absorb incredible punishment without breaking apart. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's aircraft became famous after a mission in June 1943. Engaged by a German fighter, Johnson's P-47 took repeated hits from 20-meter cannon shells. The cockpit canopy was shattered. The fuselage was riddled with holes. One shell exploded in the cockpit, wounding Johnson and damaging the controls. Yet the aircraft kept flying, and Johnson nursed it back to England, making a successful emergency landing at base. When ground crews examined the aircraft, they counted over 200 holes. The damage was so extensive that the fighter was written off as scrap. But Johnson was alive, and his survival convinced many skeptical pilots that the Thunderbolt, despite its weight and bulk, was an aircraft you could trust in combat. Stories like Johnson's spread through the Eighth Air Force. Pilots began to appreciate the careful design that had gone into the P-47, the self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires, the armor plate that protected the pilot, the redundant systems that kept critical functions operating even with battle damage. Alexander Kartvel's emphasis on survivability was paying dividends in saved lives. By mid-1943, the transformation was complete. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a questionable experiment or a source of jokes. It was becoming the backbone of the American fighter force in Europe. Production ramped up dramatically. Republic's factories would eventually produce over 15,000 Thunderbolts, making it one of the most numerous American fighters of the war. New variants appeared, each improving on the original design. The P-47D model introduced a bubble canopy that gave pilots unprecedented all-around visibility. Later versions added water injection systems that could temporarily boost engine power to over 2,500 horsepower. Hardpoints under the wings allowed the aircraft to carry bombs and rockets, transforming it into a deadly fighter bomber. But the most important evolution was in the pilots themselves. The early skepticism had been replaced by confidence bordering on arrogance. P-47 pilots knew they flew the toughest, hardest-hitting fighter in the European theater. They had learned to exploit its strengths and work around its weaknesses, and most importantly, they had proven themselves in combat against the best the Luftwaffe could throw at them. The Germans, meanwhile, were adjusting to a new reality. The easy victories of early 1943 were gone. Every mission now carried the risk of encountering aggressive American escorts who knew how to use their aircraft. Luftwaffe fighter units began reporting increasing difficulty in reaching bomber formations. Losses mounted. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were shot down by American fighters over their own territory. The psychological impact rippled through the German fighter arm. pilot diaries and letters from this period reflect growing anxiety about the American escorts. "The Thunderbolts are everywhere now," wrote one pilot. "They attack with such violence and firepower that defense is almost impossible. We are ordered to evade and attack the bombers. But this is easier said than done when 8 machine guns are firing at you." As spring turned to summer in 1943, the air war over Europe entered a new phase. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting heavy losses on unescorted bombers, but the tide was beginning to turn. And at the forefront of that turn were the American pilots in their massive, powerful, increasingly respected P-47 Thunderbolts. The Germans had laughed at the jug. They weren't laughing anymore. Not all the lessons learned in P-47 Thunderbolts came from combat with the enemy. Some of the hardest, most costly lessons came from the aircraft itself. For all its eventual success, the Thunderbolt earned another darker nickname among the pilots who flew it in training: the Widowmaker. The statistics were sobering. Between 1942 and 1945, the Army Air Forces lost over 800 P-47 pilots in training accidents in the United States alone. This represented roughly 10% of all Thunderbolt training pilots, a casualty rate that would be considered catastrophic in any other context. These men never saw combat, never faced the Luftwaffe, never escorted a single bomber. They died learning to master an aircraft that was, by any measure, one of the most challenging fighters of its era to fly safely. The reasons for these accidents were numerous and interconnected, rooted in the fundamental design compromises that made the P-47 such a capable combat aircraft. The very characteristics that gave it high-altitude performance and devastating firepower also made it dangerously unforgiving to inexperienced pilots. Consider the landing. A P-47 approaching for landing weighed anywhere from 12 to 14,000 pounds, depending on remaining fuel and ammunition. This was at least twice the weight of a Spitfire or Messerschmitt 109 and significantly heavier than any American trainer aircraft. That mass meant the P-47 had tremendous momentum, and momentum was the enemy of forgiveness. A pilot making his first P-47 landing would be accustomed to fighter aircraft that floated, that could be salvaged from a poor approach with a burst of power, that forgave small mistakes. The Thunderbolt did none of these things. If you came in too fast, the aircraft would float down the runway, eating up concrete until you ran out of space. If you came in too slow, the heavy fighter would drop like a stone, potentially collapsing the landing gear or ground looping into a fatal crash. The forward visibility was terrible. The large radial engine and the pilot's position far back in the fuselage meant that on approach, with the nose high, the pilot could see almost nothing ahead. Landing the P-47 required a constant weaving S-turn pattern on the ground to see where you were going, and a curved approach in the air to keep the runway in sight. Misjudge the flare, and you could slam into the ground before you even knew you were in trouble. Then there was the torque. The massive R-2800 engine, spinning that enormous four-bladed propeller, generated tremendous rotational force. On takeoff, as the pilot applied full power, this torque tried to roll the aircraft to the left. A novice pilot, concentrating on keeping the nose straight as he accelerated down the runway, might not apply enough right rudder to counteract the torque. The result was a swerving takeoff run that could end with the aircraft careening off the runway into the grass, or worse, flipping over if a wingtip caught the ground. Lieutenant James Goodson, who would become a leading ace with the 4th Fighter Group, nearly died on his first P-47 flight. Fresh from training in lighter aircraft, Goodson was unprepared for the sheer power of the Thunderbolt. On takeoff, the torque caught him by surprise. The aircraft swerved left, heading straight for the parked fighters at the edge of the field. Goodson managed to get airborne just in time, clearing the parked aircraft by feet. He later recalled, "That first takeoff taught me more about the P-47 than any briefing could. This was not a trainer. This was not forgiving. This was a combat machine that demanded respect." The cockpit itself was a source of danger, unlike the SPACs.